Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for joining us for a discussion of documenting and evaluating urban renewal resources. My name is Gretchen Pinio. I'm an architectural historian at the Public Archaeology Lab in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And joining me is Ginny Adams, a senior architectural historian here at PAL. We'll get going here in just a second, but just for quick housekeeping, we will have time for questions and discussion at the end of our presentation. So if you have any questions or comments you might have, please drop those in the Q&A and we will get to those at the end. With that, I will turn things over to Ginny.
Thank you, Gretchen. As most of you know, federal urban renewal projects changed the built landscape and character of cities across the United States. At its height from the 1950s through 1970s, wrecking balls, picker cranes, bulldozers, and dump trucks smashed, crushed, and hauled away historic buildings and displaced residents to make way for new housing, public buildings, and commercial development. Urban renewal was a planning principle and a federally subsidized set of programs used at the local level to rebuild economically depressed and rundown areas, or what were called blighted areas, within cities. Often these targeted neighborhoods were home to low-income and or marginalized families and were razed. Residents were relocated and the cleared land was rebuilt with middle-income rental housing, commercial centers, or public buildings. Highways and connectors were sometimes built along with the new development to bring cars into and through the downtown. Today, urban renewal has evolved and is still an active planning tool, shaping sections of cities. Preservationists, community activists, planners, and scholars are increasingly investigating and understanding the forces that shape these developments, the variations in different projects and times, their impacts, and the physical record of urban renewal. We hope to bring out and understand the relevant historic contexts at play in order to be able to accurately identify the building structures and landscapes of urban renewal programs, and also to be able to appropriately evaluate the significance of these resources as an important planning step. Aspects of urban renewal that are highly important, but that we don't have time to do much more than mention here, in addition to the loss of historic buildings and neighborhoods, include the many complexities of social, economic, and racial inequality and injustice that are still noted today, and also the intersection of urban renewal with the historic preservation movement of the 1960s and 70s, including in Boston, the major renewal of Faneuil Hall and Quincy Market, and the creation of Boston National Historical Park. Federal and local public housing programs started in the mid-1930s, but urban renewal really began after the 1949 Federal Housing Act that opened new funds for slum clearance to allow public housing in deteriorating cities. Other housing and highway acts in the 1950s and 60s provided additional opportunities for communities. An analysis in 1969 estimated that by 1967, federally funded projects had demolished 404,000 dwelling units, and highway construction between 1956 and 1967 had displaced 330,000 urban households. In Boston, urban renewal projects took place in the city center area and in residential neighborhoods. I will be focusing on the city center to set the stage for Gretchen's discussion of the identification of urban renewal resources in the city neighborhoods. Boston began planning its first 3 urban renewal projects in the early 1950s under Mayor John B. Hines. These were the New York Streets of 1952, the West End, and the South End. With the formation of the Boston Redevelopment Authority in 1957, planning expanded. It's estimated that about 1/3 of the old city was demolished during this period. Initially, these urban renewal projects did not take into account the historical or architectural significance of buildings, but instead focused solely on the removal of blighted areas wholesale, as you can see in this image. These aerials showing the West End, which was the BRA's first large-scale project, before and after the clearance of about 46 acres in the early 1960s. The central artery, the newly completed highway through downtown, completed in 1959, is in the upper left. These views of the West End show it in 1938 on the left in a historic map, and then 1990 on the right in an aerial view. And it shows the striking loss of the fine-grained residential neighborhood north and east of Massachusetts General Hospital. In this project, approximately 8,000 working class, primarily Italian and Jewish residents of the West End were evicted from their homes by 1960, allowing for the construction of new middle-class housing that was convenient to the newly developing downtown and also included commercial space. Outside of the city center in 1965, the massive 606-acre South End Urban Renewal project began, and 30% of the land on scattered sites was acquired and cleared by the BRA, which transitioned to an infill project in the 1970s. In 1963, Washington Park Urban Renewal Project was started in Roxbury, one of the first projects where the city worked with community engagement rather than the top-down planning of the initial projects, and Gretchen will speak more about that. Other projects were initiated, including one at the Fenway. Although initiated by a private insurance company and not by the city, the Prudential Center development played an important role in the story of shaping Boston in the 1960s. Changes to the state's urban renewal laws in 1961 extended tax breaks to commercial enterprises and allowed the Prudential project to be overseen by the BRA. The complex was constructed on a large rail yard in the Back Bay, which was considered a blighted area, solving the problem of how to redevelop the difficult site and providing a locus for a new Mass Pike extension to run through the city and connect with the central artery. The tower building was completed in 1965 and other buildings by 1970. Government Center was the keystone of the new Boston vision of the 1960s, intended to revitalize the city's economy under Mayor John Collins, with the assistance of Ed Logue, who had been the redevelopment director in New Haven. 60 acres of Scully Square and surrounding streets were demolished for the new complex. The principal buildings of the new Boston City Hall, the John F. Kennedy Federal Office Building, and the Government Service Center, designed respectively by Coleman, McKinnell, and Knowles, the Architects Collaborative, and Paul Rudolph between 1961 and 1971, created a statement of political and economic optimism and a strong architectural presence of massive concrete buildings within an expansive plaza. In the 1960s, the BRA under Ed Logue collaborated with some of the most notable architects and planners in the state and the country. As he stated in 1967, it is the function of distinguished architecture and imaginative civic design to see that beauty is the hallmark of the renewed city. However, while there are many such examples throughout Boston and Massachusetts, as with all categories of resources, not all urban renewal buildings are considered individually architecturally distinguished. As Gretchen will discuss, many are best understood within their social, political, and economic context, and as examples expressing the architectural design intentions, functions, and values of their time, often in relation to a larger system or cultural landscape. Moving out of Boston, although to a lesser extent than in Boston, most other cities in the Commonwealth initiated first public housing and then urban renewal projects during this period. Between 1963 and 1966, planning and approvals were put in place for the Kendall Square Urban Renewal Project on a 43-acre site near MIT in Cambridge. It was the brainchild of a local planner who worked at the BRA. 29 acres were for the use by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, for an electronic research center, and 14 acres was targeted for private development. The area was underutilized with largely vacant, obsolete industrial and warehouse buildings. However, in 1969, NASA abruptly closed its existing Cambridge facility and pulled out of the new site. The site was turned over to the U.S. Department of Transportation, and the Volpe National Transportation System Center was completed there in 1970. 24 acres went to the city of Cambridge and has been developed over time. Most Massachusetts cities have urban renewal legacies from the 1960s and 70s, and here are some examples. Fall River, Lowell, and New Bedford were shaped in part by urban renewal, which in New Bedford, in the top image, is reflected in the Whaling National Historical Park. Newburyport experienced some urban renewal demolition in the 1960s, shown in the bottom, but then shifted to restoration intentionally rather than the demolition of the downtown. In Springfield and in Worcester, they've been doing urban renewal projects since the 1970s, and both cities have active ongoing projects. In Springfield, Court Square, and in Worcester, the Medical City and Union Station. In Boston today, there are 3,000 acres of urban renewal projects under the Boston Planning and Development Agency, and the plans will be up for renewal in 2022. I will now hand over to Gretchen, who will talk about the identification of urban renewal resources using Boston neighborhoods, specifically Roxbury, as case studies.
Thanks, Jenny. So when we talk about urban renewal and particular activities that we are seeing in the urban landscape, we're talking largely about slum clearance, which was wholesale demolition like we saw in the West End, or spot demolition of specific buildings. Rehabilitation, frequently this was interior renovations. Exteriors may be reclad with synthetic siding, composite windows. And the apartment buildings were frequently rehabilitated by Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, and that often included gut rehabilitations. There was also new construction. This often made use of contemporary material and styles, and these were not always in scale with their surrounding neighborhood. So in Roxbury, there are a couple of major urban renewal areas and then more smaller projects scattered within. In the center of the image, you see Roxbury, and then the smaller dashed line inside that is the Washington Park Urban Renewal Area, which you can see in an image from the BPDA from a couple of years ago on the right. On the left was a proposed Highland Park Urban Renewal Project area, and that was published in the Globe. That was going to be a model cities area. In the field, there are a few things that kind of will make you pay attention, make you think that you're seeing an urban renewal area if you're not aware of one being there in the first place. One of those are alteration of streetscape. There's a shift in building or style or type. So frequently mid-century modern or buildings that have stylistic elements that relate to modernism in an area of late 19th century or mixed use combined in with traditional single use areas, open space or pocket parks in otherwise dense neighborhoods, and then empty lots that are just disrupting the street rhythm. So some examples of this. On the left is Cedar Street and Highland Street. These are both in the Highland Park neighborhood. And in the top image, you can see two late 19th century buildings on the left, and on the right, that's a new late 20th century building. On the bottom is Highland Street, and to the left of the blue triple decker, there's an empty lot that used to be, I think it was a monastery or a cloister, and that went away. The empty lot is still there. On the right is the north end of the Washington Park Urban Renewal Area in what is now Nubian Square. The top image is 1938. You can see it's very densely built up. In 1971, very much less so as what was called the Dudley Square Government Center area was constructed with the Roxbury District Court and Boys and Girls Club, the Roxbury branch of the YMCA of the Boston Public Library, and other large concrete buildings. Open space and empty lots, we see a few different versions of this. Top left is Marcella Street. This is also in Highland Park. And so you can see these brick row houses that have blank sidewalls that suggest that there was another building there historically. And there's lots of asymmetrical empty lots showing what was likely the result of spot demolition. Below that, there's some green space. That's the Allen Crate and Cedar Street Gardens. These were empty lots in the urban renewal period due to spot demolition that were reclaimed by the neighborhood and turned into community gardens. In the center, you see the tail end of the Martin Luther King Boulevard to the right, and then Valentine Street goes up to the left. Valentine Street was intended to be a connector from the Martin Luther King Boulevard to the proposed Southwest Expressway, which was never built. And so that was all cleared out to make way for this connector road that was never built, and the lots are still empty. And then bottom right is the Rockledge Urban Wild. And the Urban Wilds were done largely in the 60s and 70s, and they were ways that the city of Boston was trying to preserve historic open space. So not the results of land clearance, but parcels that had never been developed. Types of resources that we see, public housing. They are, as we said earlier, really related to modernist design principles. On the left are Charlene Homes 1 and 2, and those were designed by the firm of Vadar and Alpers. And they are two different styles, but they're related complexes right next to each other. In the middle is Boston Housing Authority Elderly Housing. The top was done by Freeman and Flansburgh Associates, and the bottom is Walnut Park, done by Richmond and Goldberg. Upper right is some infill. That's a corrugated concrete building, and there are many of them scattered around on lots. And those were done by, they're called instant housing apartments, and they were designed by Donald Stoll and Associates. And at the bottom right is Warren Gardens, and that was a Hugh Stebbins project, and we will talk a lot more about this one in just a couple of minutes. We get civic and public buildings. The Roxbury Municipal Court at the left and the Boston Public Library Roxbury branch in the center are both in the Nubian Square development. And then to the upper right is the Roxbury Community Health Center. So again, these are large rectilinear buildings that have different block sizes mixed together and making use of modern materials, a lot of concrete and a mix of brick. The brick kind of a throwback to earlier buildings in the area. The municipal court was designed by Roxbury Civic Center Associates, which was a joint group formed by the firms of Coleman and McKenna and Hoyle, Duran, and Berry. The Roxbury branch of the BPL was Coleman and McKenna, and the Roxbury Health Center was the PARD team, architects and planners. More public buildings, the Washington Park Mall, which was Earl Flansburgh, the Campus High School, which was a Marcel Breuer project, and the Roxbury YMCA, which was the Architects Collaborative. So you can see already that a lot of this infill was done by very well-known, very prominent architects. And they were working with the city and other developers to build really prominently cited, visually striking buildings. Open space and recreation was also a focus. Washington Park, which was historically a very small park on the south side of Dale Street, was expanded, and now we have soccer fields and a swimming pool. The Melnia Cass Rink was built as part of that, and the John Shelburne Community Center was also built as part of that. The rink particularly speaks to some of the social issues that were happening also. We all love the Bruins. Hockey was a big thing, and there were not a lot of opportunities for some of the less affluent neighborhoods to play hockey. There wasn't an easily accessible rink. The Melnia Cass Rink was a swimming pool in the summer and a rink in the winter. And so that really opened up a lot of recreational opportunities for neighborhood children. And the John Shelburne Community Center had a basketball court, but it also had language classes for recent immigrants. It had after school help for kids. So these really became community outreach projects. So it wasn't just plunking down a building. And then transportation corridors always end up happening. We've got two major ones in Roxbury, the Malcolm X Boulevard at the north end, and the Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard kind of near the middle. And these were both wide roads that resulted in some clearance for their construction. So how do we research these? What do we do? What do we look at? The basics, maps for comparative analysis, newspapers and newsletters, government documents, building permits, public safety cards, dissertations and theses. What was happening in urban renewal was a really fruitful topic for students of urban planning and architecture planning. I found multiple dissertations and theses from students in architecture and planning departments at MIT in the 70s, and then various online repositories. So here's just a scattering of some. The Washington Park Urban Renewal Area had a newsletter that went out to residents to keep them apprised of what was happening. And those are at the Boston Public Library. There's a huge amount of material at the BPL. From what I understand from one of the librarians, they saved a lot of Boston Redevelopment Authority documentation that was going to get recycled, and they digitized it, and it's available online to anybody. Public safety inspection cards, those are at the Mass State Archives, and they're arranged by town. They're generally only public buildings, but sometimes you find other properties there. Newspapers, the Boston Globe, Boston Herald, both heavily covered what was happening in Boston in particular. And then historic building permits. Not everywhere has building permits available. They don't necessarily save them. Boston did, and they've all been digitized and they're searchable. And so you can really get a snapshot of what was happening and who was doing what. These are 3 more online repositories that I use an awful lot. The first one to the left is Digital Commonwealth, and that is a repository, kind of clearinghouse of digital files from libraries all over the Commonwealth. Archive.org has a lot of the Boston Public Library's documentation. Lots of libraries have put up documents there. You can check out books, you can check out government documents. And then there's happytrust.org, and there are a lot of government documents that are available there also that you can look at. Special collections are another fruitful source of information. Northeastern University Special Collections has the Roxbury Historical Society's collections. So they have a lot of good information. Another college, Special Collections, UMass Amherst, has a lot of planning records from across the Commonwealth. And then the Boston City Archives has before and after photographs and demolition photos. A lot of their photos, by the way, are on Flickr, and you can spend hours of your day going through them. So with all of this information to look at, what do we do? How do we synthesize it? An important thing to keep in mind is a lot of what has been saved are developer packages. And so those lay out how many buildings in a given neighborhood, in a given area, were at standard, were below standard, were substandard, and thus due for clearance. What that doesn't tell us, though, is what the people who lived there felt about their buildings. And so, as I said earlier, some of these buildings have synthetic siding, have synthetic windows. And as preservationists, we might cringe if we see a little tiny Second Empire building that has vinyl siding. But the thing to keep in mind is that might be what saved that building. So we need to be telling the whole story of what was happening. Newspaper articles, including letters to the editor, are really important to get the full history of the property and what did people think of it? Were they happy about it? Did they hate it? Did they feel like they were left out of the process? And then oral histories. There have been a lot of Lower Roxbury oral histories recorded and transcribed. And there are oral histories for other projects too. Or talk to longtime or former residents in the areas that you're surveying. So my building's almost 50 years old. Now what? Most, if not all, of the mid-century urban renewal projects have reached 50 years of age, which is the sort of the base threshold for National Register eligibility, without having to convoke exceptional significance. with reaching this 50 years, that makes them potentially eligible for listing in the National Register. But it's important to understand the context and not just the facts about the individual resource. So if you were in Lisa DeLine's session last hour, where she talked about context being really important, this is where that really comes into play. What was happening around where the building is? Was there a lot of clearance? Was it spot clearance? Who wanted it built? Who didn't want it built? Was it part of a larger pattern? So those little corrugated concrete buildings that are scattered everywhere, if we were trying to nominate one of those, what was the story with those buildings? Why were they built where they were built? Who built them? Did the program end? Was it popular? If it's a residential building or residential development, who was it intended for? Who ended up living there? Did they intend it for lower income people of color and it became largely white residents? Is it the other way around? So as Jenny mentioned, we don't really have time today to get into all of the social history, but it's important to recognize and to document this social history when you are documenting these urban renewal resources. So I'm going to end with a case study. This is an example of a property that we documented recently. It's Warren Gardens in Roxbury. It was done by Hugh Stebbins and Associates, and we recommended that it was potentially eligible for listing in the National Register. The project itself was HUD-sponsored, a moderate income housing project developed by the Beacon Redevelopment Corporation on land that they bought from the BRA, and it's designed by Hugh Stebbins and Associates in association with Ashley Meyer and Associates. Both of those firms are in Cambridge. The project is one of the largest in Washington Park, second only to Carl Koch's Academy Homes 1 and 2. And it was built on the former site of 90 single and multifamily houses and various other civic and commercial buildings. So this is a large-scale clearance. Designed by a prominent architect in collaboration with the BRA, we found that the building was eligible for listing under criterion A in the areas of community planning and development and social history, and under criterion C in the area of architecture, all at the local level. The complex exhibits characteristic mid-20th century modern materials, including concrete block mixed with traditional materials such as the wood clapboards, and is used in new and experimental ways. There were concrete block partitions between each unit, which was not something that was frequently done. There were a lot of complex components factored into the design and construction of Warren Gardens, including economic and social factors, such as income level and race, along with the design aesthetics of the mid-20th century modern. In 1970, Hugh Stebbins and Associates and Ashley Meyer and Associates won a design award for the project from the American Institute of Architects. And in 1971, the Architectural Record recognized the development as one of its apartments of the year, calling the complex at once satisfyingly New England and up to date. So this, with all of this, we found that it was eligible for listing because it has various levels of significance and it's important as part of the larger story of urban renewal. So with that, I think we'll turn it over for any questions that anyone might have. And if you have any questions for us, you can always email us. Our email addresses are on the screen. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jenny.
Thank you, Gretchen. I see we have a question about describing and identifying the materials used in mid-century and urban renewal buildings. And the commenter says this is more challenging often than the research component, and what are some good references? So I always recommend that people find some good National Register nominations for similar buildings and learn from those. So that's one place to start. And also wherever you are, survey, good survey. And the SHPO office, the Mass Historical Commission, can point you to that. There are a few sort of standard references, and maybe the most complete is Theodore Proudhon's Preservation of Modern Architecture. published in 2008. And that is a really good compendium of different materials used in the mid-century when there was a lot of experimentation being done with materials, including with concrete. So that's an avenue to pursue as well. Gretchen, you might have some other things to suggest?
Yes, so one of the benefits of doing these sort of more recent buildings, newspaper articles frequently will talk about the building itself and how it was put together, what materials were used, who was building it. If you're working in Boston in particular, building permits will say materials. I've also found that the latest edition of Virginia McAllister's Field Guide to American Houses has a section on modern buildings, and that will talk a lot about materials too. Looks like we had a couple of questions in the chat. What would be a significant architectural style of single-family homes in this urban renewal period? I would say it still falls into mid-century modern in some cases. In other cases, I know we don't use the term vernacular a lot, but there's sort of a variation of a type. I found though in the urban renewal period, there wasn't a lot of single family housing being built in these urban areas. The idea was increasing the density, get more people into a smaller space.
Right, it's not a property type that really shows up much. It's really apartment buildings, complexes. So maybe that's an area where more research could be done.
Yes, absolutely. A lot of our work has been in just a couple of neighborhoods of Roxbury, so we've seen mostly just multifamily. We have another comment. For additional pre-1960 context on public housing development and slum clearance, there is a draft multiple property cover document for public housing in the United States, 1933 to 1949. That is available on the National Register website under special publications, and you can contact Paul Luce again for that information.
Yes, I think, thank you for that addition to the conversation. One of the things that we deal with is that there's a lot of information and there's a lot of resources, but there hasn't been the kind of digesting that we are always looking for when we're trying to place a resource, understand a resource, and then place it within its historic context. So we're kind of making the sausage as we go, I would say, in a way, which is exciting, you know, and really fun. But to be able to have a network of folks who are actively looking at this, not just from an architectural and urban planning standpoint, but from the full comprehensive way that we as architectural historians and planners in a preservation context really address trying to identify the context and the significance of buildings.
We have another question. What was the impetus for our research project and who hired us to do the work? Most of our work has been for the Boston Landmarks Commission as part of the MHC survey and planning grant projects every year. And so that's, if you are a local historical commission and you have a lot of survey work you want to get done, I can't recommend doing that highly enough. It's a good way to get a lot of survey work done. And with that, we have gotten to dive into various neighborhoods and really get to understand and learn a lot about how Roxbury and part of Dorchester developed.
Yes, and kudos to the BLC for spearheading that and supporting that work. I'm not aware of any other cities that have been using MHC survey and planning grant funds or other kinds of survey funds to focus on urban renewal. And that was not the focus of the BLC project, but it happened to be in the neighborhood.
Another point Devin King just reminded me of, trade magazines are a good resource. Progressive Architecture has a lot of information. US Modernist has a library, and they have digitized scads of modern and architecture magazines and trade publications. They're a great source to find any articles about particular buildings or particular architects. Thanks, Devin. Does anybody have any other questions or comments?
There is a question about getting the full name and title of the architectural history that I referenced. I think that's the Theodore Proudhon book. And I will type that into the Q&A.
Great. All right. If nobody has any other questions, which is totally fine, I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming to our session. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to myself or Jenny, and we'd be happy to chat.